Welcome to the West Virginia School of Preaching video lectureship. The following lesson will be by Skip Andrews, The Goliath Fear. Skip Andrews is a faculty member here at the West Virginia School of Preaching. He's the teacher of Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. He has served in various roles in the church throughout his life. He has done located work in Ohio, Mississippi, Georgia, Tennessee, and now currently in West Virginia. He and his wife, Helen, are working with the Sisterville Church of Christ in West Virginia. And they have 2 children and 5 grandchildren. And as I mentioned, the lesson will be The Goliath Fear by Skip Andrews.
Well, thank you for looking in today to our lesson. And I want you to know at the outset, this lesson for me on the Goliath of Fear is one of a series of lessons on various Goliaths. So I encourage you at some point to go back and read 1 Samuel chapter 17 as you think about the Goliath, the person, and how many Goliaths he caused to take place in the lives of the army of God in that situation and how it was dealt with. So today I'm going to look at the idea of the Goliath of fear and see several things in the Bible that help us to understand what we need to know about it. For example, do you know of any place the Bible says, do not fear, or do not be afraid? Most of us would probably say, yeah, I think I know one or more, or maybe you could even find a couple, but the fact is that do not fear in the King James appears 77 times in the Old Testament, and do not fear appears in the New Testament 19 times. That's 96 times do not fear. Do not be afraid in the Old Testament is at least 36 times, in the New at least 10 for 46. A total of 142 times the Bible says do not fear, do not be afraid, and there may be other phrases similar to that that appear an additional number of times. Most of these situations are regarding the people of God, and we are being told in most of these not to be fearful or afraid. So there's clearly a lot of information about it because it's a big deal. It happens in a lot of situations, and I hope that today we might be able to address some of that and give some insights about what we could do about it. As a matter of fact, there are 3 questions I want to ask and answer. The first one is, what is it? That is fear. And this will be a short answer to a very much longer question that we could give, but this is just one lesson. Then the second question is, how does it work? How does fear do what it does? And then 3, what do I do about it? Remember, David took 5 smooth stones out of the brook and used only one is all he needed that time to kill Goliath. We may need all 5 of ours, and we may need to go get some more, but they're there. But what do I do about it? We'll look at 5 smooth stones to use with reference to fear. So what is fear? Fear is something in the first place that can be a friend or a foe. In 1 Samuel 17, 11 and 24, which is the actual Goliath story, we have the fact that in view of this Goliath that was in front of them 40 days, twice a day, 80 times, and their reaction to him was not to turn to God and choose to find out what he would do about it or want them to do about it. Their choice, Saul and Israel, was to be dismayed, which is to be discouraged, and greatly afraid. And then in verse 24, all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were sore afraid. So this is an ongoing thing for weeks. The army of God, fear is a foe for them. On the other hand, the same words in Hebrew and in Greek are used to describe both sides of this sometimes. In Ecclesiastes 12, we are taught that the whole duty, the whole thing about being a human being is to fear God and keep his commandments. So it can be our friend if we learn how to direct it in a way that will lead us to God, lead us to bow before God and lead us to be obedient to God. So in both testaments, fear can refer to a fear that displeases God and leads to our failure, or a fear that he expects and deserves. So that's part of what fear is. In the next place, fear is sometimes connected with words that show how wrong it can be. In the text we just read in 1 Samuel 17, we have greatly afraid. Sometimes it's sore afraid. Sometimes it's dreadful fear, and shows how wrong it can be just with those additional words that are sort of like helping verbs, and adverbs and so forth. In Revelation 21, we have a different way of adding to the word fear to show how wrong it can be, because the fearful in Revelation 21:8 are listed with all sorts of other people whose lives are lived in such a way that they're actually going to be lost forever. The fearful and unbelieving and the abominable and murderers and whoremongers and sorcerers and idolaters and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. So that should show us how powerful it can be in a negative, bad sense, that it can actually get so big that it would cause us to lose our souls forever. Well, then the second question, how does it work? As an enemy. I'm not talking today about how fear works in a positive way, at least not at this point, but how it works as an enemy. Here are some Bible examples, and you need to read these for yourself and do more research. I'm intentionally not giving you so many references we could never get to them, but part of the purpose of being a teacher or a preacher is to encourage people to learn how to use their own Bibles for themselves. And part of this is doing that, learning how to study these matters and look them up and research these many, many, many verses that say, do not be afraid or do not fear, is part of the solution. But to illustrate, fear caused Adam to hide from God. Genesis 3:10. Fear caused the Gibeonites to be deceitful toward Joshua and the Israelites in Joshua 9:24, rather than approaching the way it would have turned out a much better way than it did, in reverence and service to God and respect for their enemy. They led to a very deceitful event that a lot of people paid a price for. Fear was a major factor in the kingship of Saul. We've already read 1 Samuel 17:11. Don't forget when Goliath was doing this thing 40 times twice a day, that Saul was one of the ones who was greatly fearing. And as time went on and Saul's kingdom began to wane and he just got totally unfaithful to God, fear continued to motivate him and be a big part of his downfall. And it led him to commit all sorts of sins against God and David and his own family. So it became something that wasn't visible when Saul became king, but he did not overcome it. Fear is a major factor in the lives of those who grow old without God. Now that's Ecclesiastes 12:5. We've already looked at Ecclesiastes 12, that the purpose of being a human being is to fear God and keep his commandments, but that comes after this. In Ecclesiastes 12, the writer is showing us what it's like to grow old without God. If you don't remember God in the days of your youth, then you're going to grow old without God if you don't change your path. And growing old without God creates all kinds of fears that are as a result of that choice. And it can destroy us and end up with life being totally vanity, which is how the book starts, because you haven't chosen to remember God and keep his commandments, fearing him with awesome respect. Fear led a prophet of God to flee to Egypt, Uriah the prophet, Jeremiah 26:21. And he ended up losing his life. but it was a motivation to run from the situation, and it was a motivation that didn't work out for him because it was improper fear. How does it work? Well, in the New Testament, we have just one illustration, and that is in the parable of the talents. Remember, Jesus talks about this. This is the last week of his life. The parable of the talents in Matthew 25 is about money. Talent is a certain amount of money at that day and time. We use the word talent in a totally different way today, which isn't unacceptable, but he's talking about money. So these three men got a certain amount of money. One got 5 talents, one 3, and one 1. The 5 and the 3, did we know all the good things they did and how they were commended for it? The 1 talent man comes back and says, I was afraid. And then he even says things about his master that he couldn't prove. I know you're a hard man, and I know you do this, and I know you do that, but there's nothing in the text that indicates that's the kind of man he really was. Fear causes us to get a distorted view of reality, of the situation, and even of other people who mean us good. They're actually intending to help us and motivate us. And so when it comes to what we call talents today, fear keeps godly men from developing into leaders in the Lord's church. Fear keeps Christians from action. Fear keeps women from living virtuous lives. Fear keeps youth from being different from the world around them. And that's why we have all this information in the Bible about how to overcome this, which includes being together, working together, calling on those who are farther along than we are, and all of that. But he was afraid, and he hid his talent, and he buried it in the earth, and he brings it back and says, here, you have what was yours to start with. When God gives us something, he doesn't mean to just get back what he gave us. He means to get back a totally developed character, a person who has learned and grown and served and is able because they have developed. And so fear keeps us. It keeps us from whatever God has next on the list for us to do. What do I do about it? In 1 Samuel 17:40, the text says, he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. I really do recommend that you read 1 Samuel 17 in connection with any Goliath, because fear isn't the only Goliath that's specifically mentioned in this text. Discouragement is, family squabbles, how to be a soldier for God. All of these are part of the actual storyline. But fear is in there too. We saw in verses 11 and 24. So David is going to deal with Goliath. He deals with Goliath by going to the brook, and he gets 5 smooth stones. People say, well, why did he pick 5? I don't know why he picked 5, but I could give you a couple reasons why I think 5 was a minimum. First of all, David might have missed or dropped one, or if he hit the Goliath, who knows what his armor bearer is going to do, or maybe the rest of the army, to say nothing of the fact that David had no reason to believe that God's army was going to back him up, which they did, but he didn't know that. Some of us might have taken 500 smooth stones and needed them all. But he took 5, so that's what we have before us. And he's going to use whatever he has to use to deal with the Philistine. Sometimes when you're dealing with your Goliath, just one of these might be all you need in a given situation, but that doesn't hurt to know where the others are and how to use them, does it? So let's look at the list briefly. First of all, realize that fear can either be good or bad. Then face specific fears. Then practice, practice, practice. Then be the one who steps out and accepts the challenge. And then what I call scriptural help. And all of the Goliath lessons I do, the 5th smooth stone is scriptural help, where we start down a path of actually gathering a lot more that we might need some other time. So let's look at each of these for a little bit. First of all, realize that fear can be either good or bad. Fear is an emotion that we must learn how to use correctly. Sometimes it is wrong, and sometimes it is commanded. Do not fear, fear. You know, we are told not to fear, and yet we are told we are commanded to fear the Lord. So sometimes it is wrong and sometimes it is commanded. In Proverbs 1, as Solomon is writing to his son, and he spends several chapters at the beginning of Proverbs giving information to his son because he wants his son to live a life that is wise. Solomon knew a lot about wisdom. He also knew a lot about foolishness because he lived so long in a foolish way. But he writes to his son, Proverbs 1:7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." So fear, reverence, respect for God that leads to obedience is a great beginning point. He talks about this again in chapter 9, verse 10, when he talks about fear having to do with respect of the Holy One, understanding and knowing God. So there's a principle here about the right kind of fear. It's the beginning of knowledge. So it can be good or bad. If you notice some other Psalms, and I've given you a bunch of references here that I hope you can write these down or come back to it. But in the second Psalm, for example, David writes a prediction, as it turns out, of the last part of the life of Jesus and leading up to his resurrection and coronation as king. And then as a result of all those victories, we are invited in verses 10, 11, and 12 to fear him, to kiss the king, to bow down before him and reverence and respect this one who went through all of that for us. Psalm 111:10 is very much like Proverbs 1:7, which we already read. In Psalm 111 is a song about reverence, talking about respect of God because of his mighty works. So the way we learn the good side of fear is to learn these things about God and his Son and his Word. Psalm 119, which is correctly viewed as a song about the Bible, it's also a song about the God of the Bible. And repeatedly he talks about the goodness of fear, reverence, and respect for God in that poem, the longest chapter in the Bible. There's also an example in the incident of Uzzah in the Old Testament, 2 Samuel 6 and 1 Chronicles 13, when it comes to the fact that, remember, Uzzah touched the ark and his life was taken from him. And the Bible talks about the fear that came to David as a result of that. And it's too bad that they didn't fear God enough before that to find out how to move the ark around, or we wouldn't even know about Uzzah maybe. But in 1 Chronicles 13:12, the Bible says David was afraid of God that day, saying, "How shall I bring the ark of God home to me?" Well, that answer was already in the Bible. But at least he feared God. He had a respect for the power of God, who was not going to give in to people disobeying him. And David learned a lesson. A lot of people can still learn the lesson from what happened that day, learning how to fear God and do what's right. And then obeying God in the sense of not fearing, obeying him when he says, don't do that. Now, that takes some work. It takes some practice to learn how to be a person who is not going to walk around and live your life constantly in fear, being afraid to move, being afraid to live, being afraid to serve, and even being afraid to die, because we've let this become such a major part of our lives. In one of these samples we have here, 2 Kings 19:6, Isaiah says to them, "Thus shall you say to your master, thus saith the Lord, be not afraid of the words which you've heard, which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me." The world is full of powerful forces that are fighting against God, and they can cause us to shrink back in a corner and just sit there in the darkness and wait for them to go away. Or we can obey the command to not be afraid and resist them as the servants of God, knowing that he's always out in front of us anyway. So it can be good or bad. Face specific fears. Israel faced the Egyptians being sore afraid, the same as in Goliath's day, but instead they turned to God for help. Exodus 14:10. Same thing, being sore afraid, but instead of going back to their tents and weeping for 40 days, twice a day, the Israelites turned to God in their fear, and he led them to victory. The Philistines feared because Israel had the ark in their camp, but faced their fear and defeated Israel. In other words, here you have the enemy seeing how powerful fear was and keeping them from fighting against God's people, and they faced their fears and actually beat the people of God, which says a lot about the people of God, but it also shows that sometimes even the enemy is afraid and they come to their senses before we come to ours. And so facing those specific fears is critical. Nehemiah knew that his enemy had been hired to make him afraid, but he faced his enemy and overcame. Nehemiah 6:13, the poets in the Psalms, Psalm 56, 91, 112, we have all of these over and over in the Psalms, that they list their fears and they list their solutions. Let's look at just one of these in Psalm 56, 3 and 11, just as an illustration of the power of the Psalms to help us understand how to face our fears and then do something about it. 56:3 says, "What time I am afraid, I will trust in thee." In verse 11, "In God have I put my trust, I will not be afraid what man can do unto me." So sometimes our fears are what other people can, we know they can, do to us. Sometimes our fears are because we know we haven't gotten ready for whatever it is by studying the Bible and learning how to do something. Sometimes our fear is that we're afraid we're not going to be a good dad or a good mom or a good kid or whatever it is. And so we don't face that and we fail. The psalmists do that. They frequently do things like this in a very practical way to help us to face the things we face, which are no different from what they faced. Solomon shows that the way to conquer the fear of growing old without God is to remember him in youth. We've covered this before, but it needs to be here because he's trying to get people when they're young to do something so that they won't even have to address that later on. If you remember God in your youth, you're not going to have to worry about growing old without God because you're not growing old without God. You've already dealt with that. And the longer you wait, the harder it's going to get to make that choice. It doesn't mean you can't do it, but it's going to be harder. At the beginning of their work as prophets, God encouraged prophets to overcome false fears. So we have these statements at the beginning of their writings. Jeremiah 1:8, Ezekiel 2:6. God's at the beginning of the work, he says, we need to deal with this, learn how to deal with false fears. And then he's not saying that their work is going to be simple or easy. It was horribly difficult. But at the beginning, face these things that I'm going to help you with, that I'm going to help you get over with and through, and you'll be able to overcome and be a victor. And then realize the emptiness of idolatry and all false religion. Do not fear their empty threats. Jeremiah 10:5. I think this is a critical one in our day because the world in my lifetime has opened up. We are far more aware sometimes of what's happening all over the place than we used to be. And a lot of what's happening all over the place today is idolatry of many sorts, many sorts. And it's not just over there anymore. It's in our face. It's everywhere we look. We can't get away from idolatry and certainly false religion of all sorts. And so we have to be willing to deal with that. Jeremiah 10:5, they are upright as the palm tree, but speak not. They must needs be born, but because they cannot go. Be not afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither also is it in them to do good. That is, these idols look powerful. Look how straight and tall they are, but they can't talk. And if they need to go somewhere, somebody has to carry them. Idols really are nothing to fear, in the sense that since they are idols, they are vain emptiness. They really can't do anything unless you let it happen to them. Then we need to practice, practice, practice. If you've ever been involved in any kind of band or music or sports, you know that you're constantly being taught and told, encouraged, and shown how to practice. I remember one kid I had in Little League when I was coaching. I drafted him when he was 9 years old, and I used to always put my catcher's glove on and catch the pitchers that I had, and you never knew where that ball was going to go. You know, I got a lot of exercise catching these kids. This 9-year-old kid was so good because he had practiced so often that I could actually squat down and basically sit on the ground and hold my glove where I wanted him to throw it. And over again, even if I moved my glove, he could hit it. Because he had practiced so much, not throwing hard, not throwing junk, just practicing hitting a target. Well, that's what practice is about. When David comes up to Goliath, he just doesn't have any fear. He's already killed the lion and the bear. Not with some high-power rifle so far away the lion and the bear didn't know he was around, but with his bare hands, face to face, he had killed them. He was ready and he was reverent. He feared God, not Goliath. With practice, our foes will fear us. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. James 4 and verse 7. Remember your victories. Do not surrender to fear. Moses taught the second generation of Israelites in Deuteronomy 7:18 and 21. He's teaching this second generation, don't do what your parents and grandparents did. Remember the victories we've just won in the wilderness, and when you get ready to cross Jordan, keep those in mind and don't give in to the fear of the nations of the land. Then be the one who steps up and takes the challenge. In Nehemiah, we've already talked about Nehemiah facing his fears. Nehemiah also attempted to get the people of the day to try to make sure they understood that as a team, as a nation, as families, as people in various cities and so forth around the land they had now inhabited once again, that they, as individuals and groups, needed to understand what God could do with them if they would just let him. Nehemiah 4:14, he says, and I looked and rose up and said to the nobles and to the rulers and to the rest of the people, be not afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and terrible, and fight for your brethren, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your houses. As men, as women, as boys and girls, we need to agree with God that he can make us what we ought to be, and then stand up. Stand up for Jesus in courage. Hebrews 13:5 and 6. Don't be afraid. He will never leave us nor forsake us. And then scriptural helps. We noted in the introduction there are at least 142 be not afraids in the Bible. 142. Think on some of them. Genesis 28, Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And Jacob began to grow spiritually. Exodus 34:30, when Aaron and all the children of Israel saw Moses, behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. They developed some reverence for God that day. This is right after the incident of the golden calf, and 3,000 were killed. And they had learned a lesson, and they learned something about fear and reverence, I think. In 2 Chronicles 20:14 and 15, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jehaziel, the son of Zechariah, the son of Benaiah, the son of Jael, the son of Mattaniah, a Levite of the sons of Asaph, in the midst of the assembly. And he said, listen, all you of Judah, and you inhabitants of Jerusalem, and you, King Jehoshaphat, thus says the Lord to you, do not be afraid, nor dismayed. There's that same word from 1 Samuel 17:11. Do not be afraid or dismayed because of this great multitude, for the battle is not yours but God's. When David went out to beat Goliath, he knew he was going with God, and the battle was going to be God's, not his. And then 2 Chronicles 32, 6 through 8. Then he set military captains over the people, gathered them together to him in the open square of the city gate, and gave them encouragement, saying, be strong and courageous. That's the opposite of being dismayed. Do not be afraid nor dismayed before the king of Assyria, nor before all the multitude that is with him. For there are more with us than with him. With him is an arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God, to help us and to fight our battles. Did you get that? If God is on your side, you're a majority, because God is a majority whether you're on his side or not. And all the people were strengthened by the words of Hezekiah, king of Judah. So here's a resolution about fear. This is my resolution. You can make it yours if you want to. There are many things that can cause fear and failure. Surely all of us know this. But we should also know that all of those threats to our success against evil can be conquered. I resolve to do just that. I will not be afraid of 10,000s of people who have set themselves against me all around. Psalm 3:6. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves torment. But he who fears has not been made perfect in love. 1 John 3:18. Do not fear of any of those things which you are about to suffer. Indeed, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. Revelation 2:10. The Goliath of fear. What is it? How does it work? And what should I do about it? Thank you for spending some time with me in this lesson, and I hope that you will profit from it and use these pointers and many others you can find in the Bible to deal with this thing that can destroy your soul.
We thank you for being part of this video lectureship tonight, and we thank Skip very much for his lesson. Tomorrow night, this video lectureship will conclude with Peter Ray Cole bringing us another lesson, this time on the subject of depression. We hope that you'll join us for that.